Alright, last video for this chapter. We're going to wrap up now with Japan, which is almost like the opposite of what was going on in Russia. So Japanese isolation comes to an end. Japan had been closed to the world for hundreds of years. And we talked about this already before. The Tokugawa regime was very closed off for hundreds of years. They basically forbid all foreigners entry into the country. They were preserving their culture, their own traditional way of life, and it was easier for them to do this as an island nation on the other side of the world from the Europeans. It was easier than non-island nations. So they were closed off, with the exception of Dutch studies, which we talked about that. They would only get involved with trade with the Dutch. Then things changed. In 1853, Matthew Perry, so American military commodore. By the way, here's an American picture, obviously a camera picture. Here's Japanese art style. I love the Japanese art style depicting Westerners. It kind of looks like a droopy dog sort of looking thing here. But anyways, all changed when Matthew Perry rolled into Edo Harbor with gunboats. So he came into Edo Harbor with gunships and said, like, look, here's the deal. You've got 1 year. You're going to open up to trade with the United States of America, and you're going to allow missionaries into your country from the United States of America, or I'm going to come back and I'm going to destroy your city with cannons, with cannon fire. Um, Here's some other depictions, right? So he brings this fleet of ships in of modern, this is paddle wheel steamship, right? The smoke billowing out and stuff. This obviously is cannon fire, like demonstration. I don't know what's going on with the mast of this ship here, but this is Japanese art style of what they saw from the American ships. So this American demon boat shows up, right? And it can cast out these cannonballs. And these American ships, this fleet of ships came in and said, you have 1 year. Open up or we will destroy you. So Japan has a decision to make. All right, the Japanese government has a decision to make. Now there is a power out there in the world that is threatening them, and how are they going to respond? The Americans do this threat initially. England and France follow suit, and it looks like Japan is going to get overrun, just like China, just like Africa, just like India, just like a lot of the rest of the world did. Anybody who wasn't industrialized is now falling to the industrial powers of America, England, France, and so on. And so Japan has a choice. Are they going to go out that way? Or are they going to fall that way? Well, what happens in Japan, so during this time period, is basically a civil war is going to break out. Many people, many of the local lords, the daimyo, right, the great names, the lords of Japan, many of the local lords started saying, hey, Shogun, you're our military leader. What gives? Because remember, Japan separated their king essentially into two figures. They had a divine right concept, but they had the emperor, who was their religious leader, and they had the shogun, who was like the military political leader. And they said, "Hey, Shogun, you're supposed to be defending our country. What's going on here? How these foreign devils are now threatening our country and threatening to destroy us?" And a civil war breaks out between people who are loyal to the shogun, and then increasingly people who are loyal to the emperor. A young emperor by the name, and I'm going to mispronounce this, I'm sure. His name is Meiji, which means basically the Enlightened period. So this is the Meiji reforms and Meiji period of Japan. He starts rising up and says, "Hey, I've got a different idea. I've got a different goal. I have a different vision for Japan, different from the shogun." Meanwhile, the shogun's trying to hold on to the traditional way of life, and he believes he can fight off the foreigners and keep their traditional way of life in Japan, their traditional culture. But Meiji is saying, no, the writing's on the wall. We need to change. We need to reform our country, or else we are going to fall like China, and we are going to fall like everyone else. And so a civil war breaks out, and he eventually, the Meiji, using a lot of support from America and other countries, if you ever, it's not the best movie, but if you ever want to watch a movie about this time period, The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise is a pretty good movie about this time period and America's involvement with Japan in their Civil War period. But eventually Meiji will defeat the shogunate armies, and this is basically the end of the Shogun period, the end of the Tokugawa dynasty, and the beginning of the Meiji period, the Meiji reforms. Meiji reforms. So what are these reforms? So Meiji, I'm probably mispronouncing it. I'm saying it in a bunch of different ways. Meiji says, hey, we see what's going on in Africa, we see what's going on in India, we see what's going on in China, and we don't want to have that happen here in Japan. So what can we do? What can we do differently than what happened there? And he looks at China and says, well, China adopted some Western technology, but they didn't adopt the learning. Remember the Chinese self-strengthening movement? That was all about Chinese learning at base, right? They would use the tools of the West, but they wanted to maintain their own culture and traditions. And he says that's wrong. That's where they went wrong. We need to go out and figure out why Europeans and why the United States of America are so far ahead. You know, what is it that they're doing? What is it about them and their culture that is so far ahead? And why is this working for them and not for China and not for anyone else? And so what he did is he sent out students, essentially. The Meiji period, they sent out people to all over Europe and all over the United States of America and said, go learn, go study, and figure out as much as you can, you know, about these people, and not just don't just bring back the factories and don't just bring back the machines. Figure out the thought process that led to that, and we need that here in Japan. And so he starts arguing for an adoption of Western legal proceedings, technology, cultural dress, and things like that start to change. And basically, he is making Japan part of Europe, part of the Western world, stripping out a lot of the traditional Japanese culture and replacing it now with the Western culture. That this is a process, and it's about 20 years. They switched the country over from being traditional East Asian society to being a very Western-based society. And really, 20 years. No other country's ever done anything quite like this. So anyways, Meiji reforms remove all the privileges of the samurai, the daimyo. They used to have special privileges in society, all gone. Get rid of the samurais. We don't need the knights anymore. Like the Japanese samurai are essentially like medieval knights. We don't need that anymore. We're going to have a modern conscript army with rifles, just like the Europeans, just like the Americans. And there's, they crushed finally the samurai and the shogunate, and he has basically total control of the country. Meanwhile, economic reforms, they're going to start industrialization, rapid infrastructure development, telegraph lines, eventually telephone lines, start building their own steamships and building up everything just like England, just like Germany, just like the United States of America. Huge improvement in education and literacy rates, and the country basically turns Western in about 20 years. It's mind-blowing. Like, no other country's done this. You see this old man here. He's probably naval. I don't know what his medals are, but he's posing here. Probably some kind of naval commander for this. He's posing for this photo. When he grew up, he would have grown up in a traditional world. Probably idolizing the samurai and idolizing the daimyo, and growing up in a traditional Japanese society. But now, as an older man, he's wearing a Western style military uniform. Here's the emperor in a Western style uniform. Right, the country totally radically changed in 20 years. Many of you are almost 20, getting closer to 20 years old. Think about that, like how the country's changed. Your own country's changed in the last 20 years. Japan's change is wild and so fast. Meanwhile, Japanese government. So the Meiji emperor is not going to be ruling everything day to day. He's not going to try to be an autocratic dictator like the czars of Russia. That doesn't work. So what he's going to do is he's going to rely on a lot of his lords, a lot of the daimyo. So the daimyo who had sided with him and the daimyo who were working with him were very wealthy people, and they had a lot of land, and they're basically going to turn into the bourgeois class of Japan. So many of these early daimyo, the feudal lords, will start building up factories and copying the U.S. European growth model. Basically, build up factories and build up their own internal industrial system. And so these people are going to be very powerful business leaders. These business leaders are eventually going to join into the new government of Japan called the Diet. Just like Tsar Nicholas II makes a Duma, like a parliament for him, even though he didn't give him any power. Well, these new business leaders, these are very wealthy, powerful people in Japan. They're going to join the Diet, and they're going to be the government of Japan. They're going to have a lot of power. They're going to advise the emperor, and the emperor still had, absolute control. He's still the emperor of Japan, so it's Imperial Japan. But the Diet is going to be there as his advisory committee, and these are the wealthy industrialist people. Government was almost entirely copied off of Imperial Germany. At this time period, that's not uncommon. Even the United States of America was copying a lot of German things. We've talked about this before, like the Prussian school model and kindergarten and stuff. Germany was considered, one of the top, countries. We copy their research and development labs, that sort of stuff. So Japan copying their government's not that crazy to think of. But Japan copies the German government and is becoming increasingly more Western. Strong imperial government develops that is very military and business minded together. So you have these feudal lords who used to be like the military leaders who would, they were the lords, the daimyo. These are the people who controlled the samurai. They were military leaders. Well, now they're also business leaders. And so imperial Japan is going to be very militaristic and business minded. And that's going to be important getting into the 20th century, World War I, World War II. Meanwhile, their economy, way more successful than the rest of the world. But, and this is a big but, and it's going to be important when we get to World War II, they are more successful. They are going to adopt industrialization. They are going to start building their own factories, and we're starting to see Japan's economy taking off way more than, say, like agricultural Russia, right? But they're still dependent on the West. Why are they dependent on the West? So England starts the Industrial Revolution because they have a lot of iron and coal and other natural resources. Germany, same case, they follow suit. America, huge country, vast natural resources. Japan is very resource poor. They have some iron, they have very little coal, but what they have is also very low quality, and they don't have as much of it as anybody else, right? So they're very resource poor. And you may have heard of this before, like Japanese swords, like the samurai sword, very famous, and you've seen it before. They're folded over multiple times. Yeah, the reason they do that folding is because their iron sucks. Their iron is not very high quality. Giving them putting those folds into it makes the iron a lot stronger, less likely to break. And so that's why they do a lot of that stuff, because it comes from iron sands and it's not a high quality. So Japan industrializes, but they don't have the resources that the other industrial powers did. So what they need to do is import things to make their industrial revolution work. They need to import all the raw materials to feed their industry. And so they basically are lacking the basics of industry. They build the factories and they build the stuff, but it's all based on imports. So like any other industrial power, what do? Well, they're lacking coal and oil and iron, and so they're going to need to expand. And so what do you think Japan's going to do? They're going to start looking at their neighbors, and they're going to start looking around in their general area and saying, who can we take from? Who has resources that we need? So obviously the weakest country that's nearby is going to be China. So Japan and the rest of the world. First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95. This is 10 years before the Russo-Japanese War that we've already talked about. So they look at China and say, hey, we should start taking over some areas of China. And this, of course, will eventually have them butt heads with Russia and things like that. But 1894, 1895, what happens is there's a civil war in Korea. Korea had a monarchy, and the people in Korea were protesting against their government. Well, China, who was the traditional, lord essentially over Korea, Korea was a vassal of China. China sends troops. So China sends troops to Korea to put down this revolt against the Korean government. They're there to support their vassal. Japan, meanwhile, also sends troops to put down this revolution in Korea. And so Korea's kind of stuck in the middle now as China and Japan duke it out over each other. So China and Japan go to war in Korea, and Korea was probably just left there in the middle as the thing really kind of evolved past Korea. Eventually, Japan beats the Chinese forces in Korea, takes over Korea, and then pushes into northern China as well too, into Manchuria. And that's going to continue on World War One or after World War One and World War Two. All right. So anyway, they ended up moving on to that. Makes an alliance in 1902 with the United Kingdom. Why do they do this? Well, the main reason why England was looking at it is they say, hey, we would love to have an ally in the Pacific Ocean. We would love to have somebody who has steam-powered ships and is an equal in the Pacific Ocean, and that can help us counter the expansion of Russia. And Japan looks at it and says, wow, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, no European country would have allied with us, right? The European countries didn't make alliances with China. They conquered China. They took over parts of China. They didn't make alliances with India. They conquered India. But now the United Kingdom, the world leader, the world power at this time, the sun never sets on the British Empire. The British Empire makes an alliance with Japan. This is a big moment for Japan. England looks at it as like, hey, now we've got another part, in this empire that will help us counter any other forces like Russia's expansion. But the Japanese look at it and say, we've arrived, right? We are at the top level. And this shows the superiority of Japan over all other Asian nations and all the other victims of imperialism. Japan embraced imperialism, right? So, a good way to look at imperialism is like bullying. Sometimes, you get bullied, bully takes your stuff, right? The bully forces you to act and dress in certain ways and change the way you viewed yourself and change the way you act. Um, Sometimes somebody gets bullied and they become a bully themselves. Well, Japan's following that path, right? Japan gets knocked around. America shows up, and then England and France, and they bully Japan, and Japan embraces it, and then eventually becomes a bully themselves. They take over the island of Formosa, which is today Taiwan. They take over Korea. They fight a war against Russia. Japan is embracing imperialism and becoming a major industrial imperialist power. This is going to lead to World War II. We're not there yet. We got World War I in between. In World War I, Japan will be an ally of the United Kingdom and the United States of America and France. So they will be on the winning side of World War I. But in World War II, this need for resources and their desire to create their own empire is going to directly butt heads with the United States of America. And that's going to lead to World War II. Also, they're going to do some horrible atrocities to the people they conquer. And that's for a later day, though. But now Japan is starting to make their own empire. So Japan goes from a country that could have been knocked around. It could have gone the same way as China or Africa or India or any of the other places we've talked about. But instead, they embraced imperialism, and now they are becoming an empire that can actually knock around other countries as well, too. So they become an imperialistic power. All right, so recap of the whole section. Russia was still struggling to hold on to their traditional power. They didn't want any changes. Many elements of the country were fighting for change. You know, a lot of the peasant classes. We talked about the intelligentsia. We talked about Leninism, which is probably one of the most important things to come out of this. But they were failing and being squashed. Industrialization is slow and was largely fought against by the government. And meanwhile, Russia was being humiliated. They lost a war against the Ottomans in the Crimean War. They lost a war against Japan, the first time a European power is ever defeated by a British or Asian, sorry. Japan is a success story? Question mark. So they embraced imperialism and started growing as a world power. However, they basically replaced their own culture with a Western one. And I'd kind of pose the question: is that really worth it? Yes, they become economically and militaristically powerful, but what did they give up? Right? They had to change who they were. They had to change their cultural identity. Whether or not you decide that's worth it, that's your decision. I mean, they saved the lives of many Japanese people, but there was a cost. There's always a cost, and cultural change is part of it. Imperialistic need for resources was perhaps greater than in an industrial country because they lacked the fundamental resources, causing fear of economic collapse, and that's going to lead to a rapid imperial expansion. And that's going to lead largely to World War II. And we'll talk about all those things later. That's the end of this chapter.